Today we're going to talk about visual art during the Gothic Age. This art was majorly inspired by Christianity, and it helped to give them a sense of hope and humanity during the time. One of the forms of art during this time were paintings. These paintings mostly depicted biblical figures with halos around their heads. People weren't put to scale, which is why this is the birth of the Creeper Jesus, which is a full-grown man sunk down to toddler size and put in Mary's lap. It's a terrifying sight to see, and if I can, I will put it into the video just so you can judge for yourself. During this time, the medium of choice was actually fresco, which means that instead of painting on canvas, wet plaster was put onto the wall and painted with tempera paint. Because this paint is, well, it's a little thin, it also gets discolored very easily, which is why all of the people look about gray-green, sickly color. One of the other major advances in painting during this time is the fact that perspective was put into the paintings, meaning that you could identify a foreground, middle ground, and high ground so that you could see what was near, relatively far, and actually far. The paintings during this time were the first to incorporate perspective, but they also started to bring back a sense of realism that hadn't been used since the Roman era. This means that people began to have natural positions, individualized expressions, things like that, but none of them will elicit the same emotion that the Renaissance age will. With sculpture during this time, majority of the art forms were built into churches because the idea of a statue that wasn't of a biblical figure was a little too idol-like for the church, meaning that it seemed like you were worshiping the statue itself as opposed to worshiping the figure that it represented. This is also the time where columns that looked like people and gargoyles were starting to become popular. They're one of the characteristics of Gothic churches, actually, and this is also when scenes were beginning to be carved into the tympanum as well, which is that wedge piece above the door. And they would usually depict scenes of heaven or hell to encourage people to come to church or to avoid one or the other. The next major art form of the Gothic Age is actually the building style. The Gothic Age actually started in 1144 with the building of the Abbey at Saint Denis, and because of this Gothic style that began during the time, it helped to inspire this entire artistic movement throughout Europe. One of the defining characteristics of the Gothic building is that there will be two towers in the front, often at different sizes. This lines up with the fascination of the grotesque during the time, though it wasn't really a defining factor in the art. Another of the characteristics that help to define these Gothic buildings are rose windows, which are big stained glass windows that exist on the front of the churches. They're very large, they're very round, and that's one of the definite ways that you can tell that it is in fact a Gothic church. Another of the key characteristics are the flying buttresses. These buttresses are external characteristics of the Gothic church. But even though they're, well, pretty badass looking, they do have a functional purpose as well. The flying buttress helps redistribute weight from the walls directly to the ground, taking the weight off of the said walls and making the church be able to stand, well, a little longer and a little taller. It also provides this sense of movement and grandeur to the building that hadn't existed in any architecture before this time. Another of the characteristics during this time are the pointed arches, which offered a new kind of stability to the churches because they, like the flying buttresses, redistributed the weight directly to the ground. Churches were able to be built higher and be able to support more weight, like the weight of a stained glass window. Another characteristic of the Gothic age is the ribbed vaulted ceilings. The arch provided the impression of height and magnificence, giving the vaulted ceiling a feeling of grandeur and elegance, while also distributing the weight directly to the ground and letting the vaults be built in different shapes, whereas previously they could only be built in circles or rectangles. You could now build an entire church in the shape of an oval if you really wanted to. Stained glass windows are the final defining factor of Gothic churches or Gothic buildings during this time. The stained glass windows were mostly made of biblical scenes. They were made of ironwork and colored glass. One of the key reasons that stained glass was such a big deal during this time was because it was easier to induct people into your religion if, they didn't speak the same language, by showing them pictures of what you were talking about and the consequences of what would happen if you didn't follow these rules that you were telling them. It's also another way to teach language, which would have been good during this time because of the amount of conquering that was going on. By showing someone a picture, they can start to associate one thing with another. Thank you, Dora the Explorer. It works on children, it works on adults, and it works on the conquered slightly willing to convert to your religion as well. Well, that's a rundown of the Gothic era art, visual art. Yep, that's all, folks. Today we're going to talk about visual art during the Gothic Age.